Welcome to this third session in Advanced Research Design for Education Master's students. I'm Dr. Sarah Black, and in this session, we're going to be looking at conceptual frameworks. In particular, we're going to explore how reading a field of research starts to inform a nascent conceptual framework. And in particular, you should start to notice how frameworks do or don't work in the studies that you read, as we did in the previous video when we examined the two papers and asked whether the conceptual tools the authors brought to bear actually served to the purposes of their study. We'll then have a look at what is a conceptual framework. Again, we're drawing on Maxwell's interactive research design. Students in the contact course would have been allocated reading chapters 2 and 3 of Maxwell's 2013 book on advanced research design for qualitative studies. And we're going to use that to lead a discussion about what a conceptual framework is. In particular, we'll talk about the role of theory in forming a conceptual framework and the difference between a conceptual framework and a theoretical framework. And we'll also look at how you can start to look at your concepts and your theory and ask yourself, how will I observe this? How will I produce data about this phenomenon? How will my data start to speak back to the concepts that I'm using so that there's a dialogue between them? Miles and Huberman in 1994 defined conceptual framework as a visual or a written product. And I really like that because often I find visualizing my conceptual framework is incredibly powerful. We'll see a lot of visualizations through today's session. And they say, quote, that it explains graphically or in narrative form the main things that are going to be studied, the key factors, concepts or variables, and the presumed relations among them. So it is a framework. It's not just a loose hodgepodge collection of concepts, but they must somehow relate together. I like to think of a conceptual framework as a toolbox of ideas that you know work together. If you were to set off to a task of a project, some kind of fixing or repair task that you were not entirely sure about the nature of, but you had a sense about the problem you were going to try and solve once you arrived at the place where the problem exists, you'd pack a toolbox and you'd put in that toolbox not every single tool you own, but the tools that you expect to need in order to deal with the problem as you currently understand it. And when you get there, you might find that there's a tool that you might need that you don't have, which case you'd have to go home and fetch it and come back. But hopefully with experience and at least some type of an idea of the problem that you're trying to solve, you'll more or less have at least 80 to 90% of the tools that you need to begin the job. And you'd need those tools to fit together. You wouldn't bring a 1/4 inch spanner and 1/2 inch nuts and bolts with you, for example. So they must also fit together. Let's look at the different components in a conceptual framework, according to Maxwell. Maxwell says that a conceptual framework can include concepts from experiential knowledge, existing theory or research, pilot studies or exploratory research, and the categories and relations that these have turned up, and can also be refined and improved through thought experiments. Let's have a look at the first one, experiential knowledge. I think there's a lot of insight and valuable understanding of an issue that can be gained from personal experience, and that it would be incredibly foolhardy to dismiss this for some kind of lack of rigor or some perception of subjective bias. Rather, we need to see that experiential knowledge is not a license to uncritically impose assumptions and values on the research. It is perhaps a heuristic that can guide us to ask questions more deeply. An insider appreciation of complexity is often fundamental to critiquing oversimplified models or theories of change. Now, anyone who has worked in a school or in a complex education institution and has, for example, had a management consultant arrive will know the experience that I'm referring to. I find, as an experienced teacher who's taught in a tough classroom, that the deficit framing of people like me from people who have not taught is very, very troubling. Now, that's not to say that the research insights of such people are totally invaluable, but rather that my experience as a teacher, embedded in the everyday practices of the institutions I'm familiar with, allows me to see things that people who've not been there won't know. And I should draw on that as part of my research expertise. What we want to do is take that experience and interrogate it more rigorously. That is, we want to denaturalize taken for granted assumptions. For example, as an experienced teacher, I've seen a lot of variety regarding student behavior in my classroom. But rather than assuming that it implies some kind of deficit nature of the character of my students or some essentialized traits in them, I should rather look at those events as symptomatic and ask myself what really could be going on here that might cause or at least influence the behavior that I've witnessed. So ignoring our experiential knowledge as a core resource of insight and concepts is really silly, because there is some types of knowledge that only experience can start to offer you. Bring it to the table, rather, and deepen it. I really recommend the book, The Sociological Imagination by C. Wright Mills. It's an oldie, but it's a gem. In it, he starts to untangle the idea that the sociological imagination is our ability to appreciate the difference between a personal problem and a social issue. For example, turning back to my prior instance where I was talking about student behavior, being able to distinguish whether this is something that's being produced systematically, that it relates to broader contours of social phenomena such as class, language, etc., alienation from schooling, will help me to see that it's not that I just have a particular problem of a difficult grade 8 class, or that my student is just a particularly bad apple, but rather helps me to suspend my normative assumptions about my students and their characters and see the broader social trends that might be informing what I'm witnessing. So C. Wright Mills is an excellent text for starting to get at being able to make that distinction. Let's have a look at some examples. For example, my own PhD was about a sense I had, a hunch, that the resourcing in the schooling where I worked was too thin. We had an incredibly competent team of people who were all very experienced and all very qualified. And we were starting a new school, so ostensibly we had a blank slate on which to establish a new type of school culture. And yet, it didn't take very long until the wheels started falling off again. And it just felt like there was too much to be done and not enough people to do it. And so I took that feeling, I took that experience, and I asked, what could really be going on here? Now, I also had experience as the school timetabler, and that gave me an unusual vantage point to think about how to organize what the school had available to it across time and space in order to produce moments of teaching and learning. It gave me an awful lot of power in the school because I could see everybody's daily routine. I could shape everybody's daily routine. So not only was the experience about the overall sense of the school and what we were struggling to achieve, but also a particular role I played in that school and what vantage points that gave me. Now, if I'm going to think about the school as being under-resourced, I would need to examine the policies that provide said resource provisioning. But if you know the South African education landscape, you know that we have a plethora of policies. So how would I know which ones to look at and which ones to ignore. Well, my role as the timetabler helped me there. It gave me a connection point to go, well, what resources shape the things that I use to assemble timetables? And all of a sudden, I went down from dozens of policies to 5. That insight, that personal experience as a practitioner provided me with the main analytical fulcrum of the thesis. That is, timetabling as an activity that all schools must engage with became an entry point to describe how trying to coordinate too few people over too much work translates policies that govern provision into everyday experience in schools. It showed how organizing space, rooms, the qualities of rooms, people and their skills and their profiles of teaching subjects, curriculum, student admissions, all came together, and how it comes together differently in schools depending on what you have available to you. I still had to articulate this in terms of a credible theoretical framework. So I needed to go and see who else had looked at arranging time and space in organizations, particularly in schools. Who else had looked at the material foundations of these types of arrangements? And I turned to 2 different theoretical frameworks to build my conceptual toolbox. I looked at the work of Bourdieu, who talks about different types of capital. So he has a framework that allows me to talk about resources of multiple types and the types of practices that resource availability has, as well as resources being contextual. What kinds of resources are usable and what kinds of resources are not usable is shaped by context. Now, Bourdieu gave me the language to talk about that. But he didn't talk about space and he didn't talk about time. Lefebvre does. And he gives me the language to talk about how I can measure space and I can put it on a map and I can put it on a timetable, but that's not the same thing as what happens in people's everyday life when they walk through the staff room. And so I combined these 2 theorists and their languages of description in order to be able to articulate more concretely the hunch that my experience gave me. What I like about this as example is it shows you how there is this dialogic arrangement between having a heuristic instinct informed by experience and then going to find the language one needs to be able to articulate it precisely and rigorously. And that leads us to the second part of what Maxwell says is in the conceptual framework. That's existing theory. Now, I've talked before about the difference between a grand theory and a grassroots theory, and we can articulate a little bit more about that here. A grand theory is often a very well-established and abstracted tradition drawing on a particular theorist. Marx is a very good example. Frere is a very good example. So a grand theory would be a very well-established, respected tradition of using a particular set of concepts and theoretical relations. And you will find a whole canon of literature that aligns itself with that theoretical tradition. Grassroots theory is more when you start to try and articulate a theory of your own as to what's going on, premised on the data. That is, you're not going to go and draw big fancy names from philosophers off the shelf. You're going to perhaps bring your own theory of change or your own hypothesis, to use a more positivist term, as to what's going on. And then you're going to see how that interacts with the data you produce and whether you refine it, change it, reform it, or toss it out completely. Now, often grand theory started as a grassroots theory. If you go and read work done by empirically informed theorists, Bourdieu uses his studies of Kabyle households in northern Algeria to formulate his theory of practice. Claude Lévi-Strauss used his work with anthropology to come up with his structural theory of culture. Marx drew extensively on factory reports, on data produced by his friend Engels in English factories in the mid-19th century in order to write Das Kapital. So you can go and see a lot of these big theories, and you'll see that they started as grassroots theories, and they just built up over time. But a theoretical framework, it's a well-established theory or set of concepts and relations that someone else devised, and is probably by now made abstract from its original roots. As I said, often from empirical investigations, but not always. Here are some examples of theoretical frameworks that are commonly used in qualitative education research. I've mentioned Marx. The tradition tends to be called historical materialism, although there are now many flavors of Marx, feminist Marxists, post-human post-humanism Marxists, etc. There's quite a lot of different traditions now of how to use Marx, open and closed forms of Marxism, etc. I've mentioned Bourdieu, practice theory. Some people love him, some people hate him, but he's a well-known theorist in education research, and he wrote extensively about education. Vygotsky, also very well known, although his work sat behind the Iron Curtain for a long time before it was translated into English. Situated learning, social psychology of learning, cognitive theory, social cognitive theory. Basil Bernstein, also an education sociologist from 1960s, 1970s UK, was looking at how curriculum structure was related to the reproduction of social class status in English schools, also a theory embedded in originally empirical investigation. Bruno Latour, actor network theory. Paulo Freire from Brazil, humanizing pedagogy. Michel Foucault, discourse analysis, in education often used with Fairclough. Foucault wrote somewhat about schooling, but his primary focus wasn't schooling. I've seen Nancy Fraser being used a lot more in education recently. She is an analytic philosopher who looks at the philosophy of politics and justice, particularly. That's a normative theoretical framework, whereas the others so far are descriptive ones. But there's a whole lot more. I've also seen Lefebvre. I mean, I use Lefebvre myself. He tends to be used more by geographers and architects. Social reproduction theory is used by sociologists, Tithi Bhattacharya and others. Gilles Deleuze, rhizome theory. Jacques Lacan, psychoanalysis. Frantz Fanon has taken a resurgence recently in education, looking at coloniality and racism and the effects of alienation when one is living in a society shaped and structured by colonial racist forces, historical and contemporary. Black liberation theology, we'll look at an example later that draws on this tradition. Post-colonial theorists, Homi Bhabha, Gayatri Spivak, Walter Mignolo, Achille Mbembe, Ndlovu Gacheni, Edward Said, Stuart Hall, Judith Butler, Arjun Appadurai have done a lot of work on cultural studies. There's so much out there. In fact, there's so much it can often feel overwhelming. You don't need to know all these theories unless you're a theory buff and this kind of thing is your cup of tea. You don't need to know them all, far from it. You do need to be aware that there's a wealth of tools out there, and that the theory that you might choose to use in your conceptual framework will act as a lens and shape what you see and exclude other things that you won't see as you produce and analyze data. I am a fan of reading at least more than one theory because I think one can only start to really understand the limits of a particular theorist when you're able to see them in relation to another theorist. And only in that relation can you start to compare and contrast what each theorist is good for and what they're not good for. But you do not need to read all these. Please do not get that impression at all. The purpose of outlining this is to show what a rich toolbox education researchers can bring to their work. Now, how much theory should you use? What's enough? What's too much? You don't need to have a theory from a big name to do your research. Rather, think of it as a specialized tool. It could make your life easier if you pick the correct one. It will help you see things you didn't see before, and it will help you to draw on a canon of literature that's very well established in order to understand analysis and methodology. So you could technically do a lot of DIY work with nothing but a hammer and a screwdriver. But gosh, when someone brings you a power saw, you aren't half glad that you got one if it's the tool you need. And it isn't just a useless artifact if it's not the tool you need. That's kind of what theory is like. Now, no theory off the shelf is ready for your study. You still have to do the thinking work. You still have to think through, what does it let you see that you couldn't see before? What does it not cover? What does it not describe? And how might it distort your focus? How might it be getting you to look at things that actually misguide you? So I like to think of it as a lens. This is a common metaphor used regarding theory. Just like a lens in a microscope. If you've ever taken a sheath of onion cells at school in science class and looked at it under a microscope, you pull through the correct lens and all of a sudden everything draws into focus and you can see all the cell walls, you can see all the things inside the cell, and it's beautiful. You've got the wrong lens on and you can't see anything at all, it's a blur. Or when you go and get your eyes tested at the optometrist and he's flicking over different clear circles of glass, and then sometimes even colored ones, and sometimes even combinations of them. Different lenses bring different things into focus. Sometimes you even combine two lenses to get a different result. But the relationship matters between the gaze, the lens, and the object being analyzed. That relationship needs to cohere, and that comes back into Maxwell's interactive research design. No single lens can show you everything. You need to know what your tool does and doesn't do so you can make an informed decision. And your supervisor will be super critical there, super important for helping you to make that decision at this stage in your career. But also understanding what your lens is good for, whether it fits your question, whether it's going to do the work you need it to do, it means you've got to get reading. You've really got to read. Read people who've used that theorist, read people who've critiqued that theorist, and I would strongly advocate at the master's level, you need to go and read that theorist. Unfortunately, I have encountered far too often people who use a theorist or critique a theorist having not ever engaged the primary text. And that's going to always be problematic. So you do need to read, and you need to read widely. Over-applying a theory or misapplying a theory will distort your findings, just like going to the optometrist and getting the wrong lenses in your glasses will make it difficult for you to see what you're doing. Here's a lovely example, though, about how no one theory comes off the shelf ready for your study, and you need to keep re-examining it interactively and dynamically as you produce and look at your data. So in this particular study, this person has a very interesting problematic. They are thinking of churches as classrooms, because they're noticing that in churches, there are types of discourses deployed and subjects produced relating to people's idea about who they are in society and where they fit in society. But in addition to churches producing a certain idea of self and a certain idea of the world, there's also resistance to the messaging within church groups. And so this person is looking at discourses and how people are produced by or resisting discourses in churches. Now, they started with a loose collection of different theories that they thought might speak to this problematic. A little bit of Foucault, discourse and subjectivity. A little bit of Gramsci, drawing on the concept of hegemony, which refers to how ideas and ideals and sets of logics become dominant and taken for granted and commonsensical in society. They also were drawing on Black liberation theology, because this was an interesting historical tradition of challenging dominant discourses in church spaces and communities. But it rapidly became apparent that it was difficult to say how these different theoretical and conceptual ideas hung together in a framework. And so the person decided to go with the Foucault as the base theoretical framework and to articulate the Gramsci, the Black liberation theology concepts in relation to the Foucauldian one. So the Foucault became the foundation, and the others were connected into it. Now we've achieved a little bit more cohesion. The person started to produce some data. And what was really interesting was that data production turned up something unexpected. Because while discourse analysis looks at texts, both written and spoken, and looks for the kinds of logics and assumptions that those texts prep up and create, what the person didn't expect was that the speech acts in the churches they're examining were really quite tightly structured. And that wasn't expected at all. And so now they've started looking at research that looks at turn-taking and structuring of speech acts in classrooms and asking, well, does this help me to explain what I'm seeing in my data? Because Foucault doesn't give me this. Foucault doesn't tell me how the structure of the speech act might itself be indicative of how people relate to each other and the power between them. So can you see how the framework here is dynamic? You start with a loose collection of ideas, you then try to bring more cohesion into them, but you keep it in dialogue with the data production. And if it's not allowing you to describe what you're seeing in the data, you need to go back and revisit it. That's what's going to produce a solid conceptual framework, one that articulates with the data. And I think that it's because the Buthelezi paper we examined as preparation for this session didn't do this, that the data and the concepts don't line up. Here's another example. And what this does is it indicates how a conceptual framework shapes what you focus on and what you find interesting in a particular situation. We're going to talk about the idea of examining science labs in schools and how their availability and their equipment shapes what people can do and what kind of learning and teaching happens. So if you brought a lens that focused on pedagogic practices and enablers and constraints in relation to you've just walked into the science lab, you might look at how teachers are interacting with objects. And you might use Latour's actor network theory to look at that. But you also might say, well, how is the teacher constructing learning moments? And how are the students responding to them? You might use Vygotsky and his successors, Luria and Leontiev. You might use CHAT, which is called cultural historical activity theory. So you're looking at activity as it relates to culture and history in a moment. But that lens would show you not the beakers and the flasks and the Bunsen burners, but what people are doing with them and how that relates to affordances, so in constraints or possibilities of activity, or it might relate to the cognitive development of children. But you also might bring a different lens and go, well, how does this lab enable teachers to meet curriculum advisors' expectations of curriculum coverage? Is there something related between the equipment the teacher has available to them and how they're able to meet those expectations? And what are the power relations between curriculum advisors and the teachers? And what is the role of the physical apparatus of the lab in mediating that relationship? You might use a social relation of power. You might look at Bourdieu, you might look at Foucault and see how a teacher's struggles are invisible or visible to a curriculum advisor. What if you were interested in the material affordances of that space, the infrastructure provision, and the school's geography even? I have been in a science teacher training workshop where teachers located in privileged elite schools in the Cape Townian southern suburbs didn't even bat an eyelid at the information they were being given by a chemical storage safety officer about what to do with one's metals, non-metals, what to do with one's flammables, what to do if an experiment was about to go kaboom in a classroom, eye baths and chemical showers and fume cupboards. And all the teachers from the impoverished, mostly black schools out on the Cape Flats were just shaking their heads going, we don't have half. So how do the affordances of the spaces of the school relate to school geography, relate to how South Africa's historical spatialized differentiation of advantage and disadvantage? Would Marx help you here? Would Lefebvre help you here? I've been in a school where they had the equipment, but they had such an infrastructural problem with the school with damp that the equipment was all spoiled. So how does the maintenance of the building and the base infrastructure shape the affordances and the viability of the science lab? A different lens, a different focus. What if you were interested in the relations between students' performance on summative assessments and laboratory facilities? Would you perhaps do a quantitative study here? Could you get comprehensive representative data sets that showed what schools had available to them, which you could connect to students' results and look for some kind of correlation? A different focus again. You could look at the relation between the practical and theoretical components of the curriculum and say, well, how do you expect students to understand redox reactions when you can't bring out a Bunsen burner and show them that kind of reaction? You might use someone like Bernstein to ask that question. The point is, you're looking at the same particular object, science labs, but you are seeing very, very, very different things depending on the lens you choose to look at them with. Now, the last two components in Maxwell's idea of a conceptual framework are pilot studies and exploratory research, or thought experiments. Both empirical and thought-based examinations on the focus of your study prior to your actual data collection can be incredibly, should I say data production, can be incredibly powerful. For example, when I was looking at school timetables and thinking, how am I going to systematically analyze these things? I actually took my old school's timetable and played with it, had a crack with it. So that would be exploratory research, for example. Pilot studies could involve visiting a different site and watching, talking to people who've done research in the field before, looking at the literature that has conducted similar research, which you should do for your literature review, talking to practitioners, even running a mock interview. There's a nice example in the Maxwell reading of families with a cancer diagnosis, where the researcher actually had mock interviews with her own children. Your thought experiments could involve thinking through possible answers to the questions you want to ask in a survey or an interview, imagining how you would go about producing data in a particular way and thinking what could go wrong, adopting an antagonistic mindset, trying to poke holes in them, trying to ask yourself, what would an unfriendly critic say? And asking how will you observe this, which we will look in the third part of today's session. What you're really trying to get at is saying to yourself, well, how should I decide which theories to try? What experience to draw on? And constantly bringing it into conversation with your context and your questions. Let's look at some more examples. Let's look at a master's with a minor dissertation looking at applied linguistics, which focused on what secondary maths teachers believe. Located in an Xhosa-speaking rural Eastern Cape village, what do they believe about the relationship between making meaning in the maths classroom and the use of language? Now, this was in a school where the textbooks were English, the exams were in English, but the only people in the village who could speak English were the teachers, who did not reside in the village. They resided in a town some distance away. And the students' English was not proficient at all. So you've got this problematic about English effectively being a foreign language in the context, and yet very much being the language of assessment. You compound that with the fact that the way maths is spoken and the way maths is written is very, very different. So now you've got register as well. In this context, the students are failing maths abysmally. So one must ask whether they're understanding the material that they are being asked to learn. And how are teachers navigating this challenge that the students really can't work off the textbook independently? How do they understand the way that they talk to the students and how this relates to the symbolic representations in the textbook on the child's desk? And the study built up a conceptual framework that contained most of Maxwell's components. There was the experience of the researcher. This person was a secondary mathematics teacher themselves. They'd learned Xhosa to teach maths. They'd worked with students in UK schools who effectively were English foreign language speakers. But it also included theoretical tools, work on how teachers think about mathematics and what they believe about it, work about mathematics and language, particularly in the South African context, drawing on the work of Jill Adler, and also looking at a philosophical theory of teaching as the process of altering beliefs. And that was from the work of Thomas Green. And what it produced was a conceptual framework that looked somewhat like this. Mathematics, teachers' beliefs about mathematics, teachers' beliefs about language, teachers' beliefs about teaching and learning. That later got refined during data production to include that these must be embedded in context. And really the sweet spot that the research was after was that middle intersection of the Venn diagram. Now, in hindsight, this was overbaked. It was the wrong theoretical approach. A simpler approach would have been to just use Bourdieu, straight up. It would have contained all these things, and that theoretical toolbox wouldn't have to be so overcrowded. But it worked. It kind of worked. Let's look at another illustrative example. This is my own PhD, again, coming back to the timetabling. So I was interested in how differentiated access to resources gets mediated through timetabling arrangements to shape different rhythms of teaching and learning. And the problematic was that schooling results track with resource availability, historically and in the contemporary moment in South Africa. And it articulates with students' language repertoires, their curriculum options in high school, where they are located, and their historical assets that they have to work with. And it's very concerning that historical inequalities in teaching and learning are being reproduced. Now, this conceptual framework was a lot more elegant. Again, an experienced mathematics teacher, timetabler in the school, that sense I mentioned, that heuristic that guided me towards the sense that things were not stable, not enough time or space to do the job. And then the theoretical tools involved something that talked about being able to draw on different types of resources to produce or reproduce social status, and a theory of time and space. And it also needed a pilot, a thought experiment. As I said, I used my own old school timetable and brought in extra concepts. These were not from Lefebvre or Bourdieu. I needed the concept of elasticity, how many spare staff or spare rooms are available at any point in time in the school. Modularity, how can lessons be bundled up in blocks that enable a certain liquidity within, for example, a grade or a subject. And granularity, how long and short are lessons? And what does this do to the rhythm of the school? Is it bitsy, or is it nice and regular? Is it a good tempo? So I still had to adjust the theoretical tools. They were inadequate to produce my whole conceptual framework. But this was a much more powerful and much cleaner conceptual framework that did the job. And it really became that power tool. It became that electronic saw that I needed when I really had some heavy duty cutting to do through my data. Now, literature reviews in Maxwell's model are part of your conceptual framework, because as you read more and more, you do understand your concepts far better. You come across common ideas. You even might use them to do further literature studies and to conduct searches. But as you start to review the literature and you start to notice conceptual distinctions or commonalities or trends, pay attention to how they are defined and try to find empirical studies, if you can, that have used the concepts you want to use to see how they've been interpreted, defined, and operationalized. Because when you notice those similarities and differences, you sharpen your own definition, and you start to also identify gaps that your research fits in. We'll look at that more in session 4, though. We're going to look at how your concepts and your understandings of conversations between different groups in the canon of literature relating to your research will help you to devise a strategy to structure your literature review that doesn't come across as just, well, he said this and she said that. As you're thinking about your own emerging conceptual framework, I really can't strongly recommend enough that you start jotting down maps of ideas, whether you use a whiteboard, just a blank piece of paper and a pen. Play around with arrows, relations, how you think things hang together. What are sub-concepts of perhaps a larger concept or holding container? Here's a photo from my own PhD. Right at the beginning, when I was still figuring things out, I look at it now and I think, my goodness, what a lot of tosh. What a lot of rubbish. This is not how things work at all. But what it is it's evidence of thinking in action. It's amazing how much you can start to articulate and then scrutinize your own ideas when you put them on the page and you doodle. The final conceptual framework looked nothing like this. But it's still nice to look back and go, you start a process by drawing and sketching and trying to put into concrete terms what is in your mind. And when you do this, you sharpen your concepts because you start thinking with them. The other way that you sharpen concepts is when you actually use them in data production and analysis. You might start yourself, well, okay, I've got this concept of a belief. How on earth am I going to see it? What is it? How would it manifest? What sort of data would I produce in order to get at that thing? Especially if it's a tricky concept like belief, which has no material manifestation. And how could you have the wrong end of the stick? How could you observe that? You might think that you're looking at A, but you're looking at B. You know, this sort of study of this old story of blindfolding scientists and putting them in a room with an elephant, and one grabs the trunk and says, oh, it's a snake, and the other one grabs the tail and says, oh, it's a string, and the other one grabs a leg and says, oh, it's a tree. You know, you can be mistaken if you are missing a part for the whole. You've got to think about how that might be the case and what you're going to do about it. I think that trying to imagine how one is going to get at different concepts is one of the most fun parts of research design and methods, and it can be really, really fun and creative. Here's a nice example. This is drawn from Brigitte Busch's linguistic self-portraits. How do you get a sense of the different bits of language people have accumulated over their lifespan, what those language repertoires mean to them, their confidence in them, the dominance or the marginalization of different languages, how they blend or mix, or and Bush came up with this idea of a language self-portrait outline, very basic outline of a human, where a person can color in that human in a representation that they feel reflects their own linguistic repertoires. A very creative way of observing or documenting linguistic repertoires and giving voice to participants. Another one, a school's rhythm. How do you look at a whole school's rhythm? You can't be at all places at all times. In this case, noise. The sonic scape of the school was invaluable. And you could hear the scraping of the chairs before the bell started to ring, which heralded the start of break. You could hear the noise die down as the first lecture or lesson of the day started. You could smell even the frying burgers in the tuck shop, which told you break was on the way. So it doesn't have to just be visual data. Audible data, even smell can be very helpful when you're trying to observe a space or place or practice. Now, how you represent those concepts to your readers can also be creative. Here's an example of how I was trying to show how schools stuck to their timetables. It's one thing to have the timetables, another thing to stick to it. And this was a way that was trying to not quantify that adherence in an artificial way, but still to visually represent to the reader how good schools were at sticking at their timetable, where green indicates adherence, yellow means a room change, but the lesson went on. Orange means a substitute teacher, which you can see across the two schools was actually not that different. White means an open, empty room. And red means a missed lesson because the room or the teacher were not available. And this was quite fun. It was laborious producing these representations, but it was fun to come up with the idea. So it's not only about how you will observe concepts, but it's also about how you will show them to your reader. Now, the Maxwell reading talks about matrices, and that can also be a very useful way of thinking through your concepts and how you might start to sharpen them by articulating their manifestation and their representation. So let's look back at our example with the teacher's beliefs. And that sweet spot was what we wanted in the middle. But you don't have to think very hard to realize that the problem with beliefs is sticky, because what people tell you they believe is not necessarily what they actually believe. And you've got the problem as well when one starts to dig into the literature about beliefs that people might think they believe X, but they behave in way Y. And how does one make sense of that contradiction? Also, how do beliefs relate to each other? So what one can also do, and this is in chapter 3 and chapter 2 of the Maxwell reading, is you can take your concept and you can say, well, how will I observe this? And start to bullet point techniques that you might use in order to get at it. Perhaps multiple techniques for the same concept in order to cross-reference. And then ask yourself, how could this be wrong? This is a very valuable exercise to start plotting once you have a collection of concepts. What are the main points to take away from this session? Firstly, that a conceptual framework is a set of categories and ideas and how they link together. That your conceptual framework will change, not only as you deepen and develop your proposal for your research, but also as you start to try and put those concepts to work against the data you produce. That's all right. In fact, I think that's desirable. You want that dynamic relationship between the literature, the conceptual framework development, the data production, and the conceptual framework development as well. Think about the example with the churches that we talked about earlier. And that's why we talk about an interactive research design. It stabilizes, but it never ossifies. It doesn't become brittle and static. Now, concepts can come from your experience, from a theory that you adapt, pilot studies that might inform you a little bit more about the thing that you're going to have a look at, thought experiments. And as you develop and refine it, you should ask how it articulates with your goals and your research question. And of course, how you are going to observe it. What kinds of data would align with it? How can you be sure? Let's have a little pit stop, a little signpost moment about where we're going now that we're 3 sessions into this course. Here's the interactive research design framework from Maxwell. And we've looked at goals and research questions. We sort of half looked at conceptual framework today because we haven't looked at literature review yet and how to write it, as well as how to go about doing it. It's no small task, and often master's students find it very hard. So that's going to be session 4, is on the literature review, which will then complete looking at the conceptual framework component of the model. In session 5, we're going to look at methods. We're going to look at the different things one can do in order to produce the data according to the framework, in accordance with the question and goals, and also at types of research that might guide you as a sort of template, case studies, ethnographies, critical discourse analyses, etc. And in session 6, we'll look at validity. We'll look at how in qualitative work, one addresses the question about how one's data might be misrepresenting the phenomenon at hand, or how you might be misinterpreting it. Session 7 will not be on YouTube, unfortunately, but it's a very nice example of how this design also works for a quantitative framework. And that's with a guest lecturer who did a large study in science. And then session 8, we will look at ethics, not just the bureaucracy of ethics, but also the actual practice of it as an ongoing disposition towards one's research and one's research participants. In the next session, we'll look at literature review and how others have done it, particularly asking how to structure it and what constitutes enough. But I hope by now it's clear that reviewing literature is not just about locating a gap, but also seeing about how others have gone about conducting research, the concepts they've built to do so. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this interesting and useful. In preparation for session 4, you should access and download these 4 papers, which we will use as a spine to structure our discussion around literature reviews and what they're for at the master's level. Take care until next time.